Well, hello. Welcome to Capturing Christianity. My name is Cameron Bertuzzi. I am exposing you to the intellectual side of Christian belief. That's what I do here on my channel. Thank you for joining me tonight. I'm talking with Dr. Tyler McNabb about a subject called religious epistemology, which is basically just a fancy phrase, a fancy two set of words for knowledge about God. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, and so religious epistemology is the study of religious knowledge about religious claims. This topic is actually at the center of lots of discussions about religion, and even in the title of this video, skeptics will sometimes say that we can't know that God exists because there's no proof of his existence, and that's a claim about the nature of religious knowledge that religious epistemologists like Dr. McNabb are interested in analyzing. So if you want to learn new, exciting things about apologetics, you want to see intelligent conversations between Christians and non-Christians, then why not like this video, subscribe to my channel, turn on the little bell so you can get notifications when I post new videos. Before we get into the interview today, just a quick reminder that I support my wife and 2 young children through this ministry, so if you find the work that I do here valuable, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Just head over to patreon.com/capturingchristianity. What you can do with Patreon is you can gain early access to all of my videos. I'm working on a video right now in response to Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson. He makes some comments about God that I've analyzed at some great depth and invited some philosophers to give their opinions about. So once that video is ready, I'm gonna push it out, and everybody, all of the patrons that are supporting me will be able to view that early. You can also gain access to the Bereans, which is a private Facebook group. I've got the slide up here, where we just have random conversations. We can encourage each other. It's a great group. So and that's what you get if you support Capturing Christianity at $5 a month. And another exciting thing that we have going on is that this video is actually sponsored by a company called Software Development Pty Limited. They are a company that bring people's software ideas to life. And so if you would like to sponsor one of our future videos, feel free to contact me. If you want to contact me or sponsor a video or just say hi, then check the link in the description of this video right at the bottom. You're going to see a little email, or actually I don't think I have my email there. It's just a link to my website, and you can contact me that way. Well, all right, let's get into the interview for tonight. So like I said, I have Dr. Tyler McNabb, who is actually a good friend of mine nowadays, and he's living in China. So actually what I wanted to do, Tyler, is normally what I do is give an introduction of my guest, but I'm gonna let you do it because you have so many different things going on. So just tell my audience who you are, what you do, and some of the stuff that you're currently working on.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. It's always a pleasure to talk with you and to be on here. So I'm doing some research right now on classical theism and Buddhism, and seeing if one can synthesize, or to what extent one can synthesize the two. But my sort of what I'm known for, what I do a lot of, is religious epistemology, like you said. So I have here, shameless promotion, Religious Epistemology, it's Cambridge Element series, and here co-authored with Eric Baldwin on applying Plantinga's religious epistemology to world religions. And as of, I guess, something like 3 weeks or so, I have a edited volume with John DePoe coming out, 5 views on Christian religious epistemology. I'll defend a view. There'll be some other views in there as well that we can talk about later if you want. Right. But anyway, it comes out February 6th. And so as of now, I have 4 children and married for Priscilla for about 11 years. And I was raised in Houston. So yes, Rockets, Westbrook's going back to Oklahoma tonight. So go Rockets. That's about it.
Yeah, once this interview is over, I'm sure that both of us are going to be turning on the Rockets game. So we'll get through it as fast as we can. No, I'm just kidding. This stuff is super important. Like I was mentioning in the introduction, you actually have a phrase that I picked up on, and I like to use it every now and then. Epistemology covers a multitude of sins, or good epistemology covers a multitude of sins. And I think that it's a funny phrase, but tell me why you think that's actually true.
Yeah. So when I'm dialoguing with my colleagues who are metaphysicians or ethicists, or they have some other branch. So I mainly do a lot of epistemology and comparative philosophy, and they'll be masters of other disciplines. Anyway, when I hear them talking, sometimes I can sort of object and seem like I know exactly what they're talking about, or I'm a lot more learned than I actually am in reference to their field of inquiry, because I can just pick out some epistemological assumptions and contribute to the conversation positively. So I feel like epistemology has certain resources that it can speak in a certain way that oftentimes other fields in philosophy don't have as much versatility. And so you can, if you know epistemology really well, like if you master it, your sins of not knowing as much as you should about other philosophical fields can oftentimes be covered, so to speak.
Yeah, and we're going to get to this claim that, you've got to have proof in order to know that God exists. And that's something that we're going to see is an epistemological claim having to do with the study of knowledge, and specifically religious knowledge. And it's good epistemology can expose why that assumption or why that question or why that claim is a bad one. And it's really fun to think about. Religious epistemology is a subject. It's one of my, I don't know if this is even a phrase, it's one of my pet topics. It's one of my pet subjects. It's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about.
Yeah.
Well, tell me, just give me an overview of what religious epistemology is.
Yeah.
And maybe we can do like a little historical analysis as well. So like throw in some history of where religious epistemology was and sort of where it is now.
Sure. So religious epistemology, as you mentioned earlier, is roughly epistemology in general, right? Is the study of knowledge, but more broadly speaking, the study of rationality and warrant and justification aren't these epistemic concepts. And religious epistemology is applying these epistemic concepts as how they relate to, say, religious belief and practice. So questions about, can we know that God exists, or are we rational in our belief that God exists, or is my belief that Christianity is true, is it warranted, right? These questions interest you. You're interested in religious epistemology. So this is the view that I take, that I defend a lot. I mentioned the name Plantinga. He came along in the second part of the 20th century and argued that religious belief can be properly basic. That's to say, religious belief can be justified or warranted apart from argumentation, right? It can be rational apart from argument. And this was kind of an interesting sort of view that I think actually is historically rooted. So I take it actually that there are different figures in philosophical history that argued for religious epistemology. St. Paul, St. Aquinas, for example, are two individuals who I think did. But when he came out with this, it was sort of in the heyday of analytic philosophy. Logical positivism died a couple decades previously, and so there was still, I think, widespread in analytic philosophy this evidentialist objection, where in order to know that God exists, you would have to have good arguments, sound arguments, and or proofs, even stronger terminology. And so Plantinga and God in Other Minds, I believe that volume was like 1967 or so, somewhere around there. He argued differently. He argued that that wasn't the case, and that sort of was a paradigm shift, I think, with a lot of analytic philosophers. And so that's what I've spent a lot of time sort of defending, that belief in God can be properly basic.
Right. And when I post something on Twitter or even on YouTube, and I'll say like, hey, by the way, God exists, normally what I do is I follow that up with an argument, or I follow it up with something like the contingency argument, and I give arguments and evidence for the claim that God exists. But I guess what you're saying here is that the prevailing view, at least up until Plantinga came along and sort of shifted gears for everybody and made them start thinking that maybe this view called evidentialism, maybe that's not the right way to think about it. And actually, I don't really like that term, evidentialism, because you adopt something that is compatible with evidentialism. And even another philosopher, his name is Trent Doherty, he's argued that evidentialism is compatible with the view that you give. So the terminology is sort of irrelevant. Really, what's going on here, and I know that you talked about like Aquinas and Calvin and stuff, and those people sort of took the same view that we can have this innate knowledge of God and that you don't have to have arguments and all of this evidence for your beliefs because you have this sort of innate, inbuilt sense of God. But the prevailing view in philosophy, at least in like the 19th century, 20th century, was this kind of, let's get away from the terminology of evidentialism. Let's just say that you had to have arguments.
All right.
Okay, you had to have some good argument for your belief. And so when I post something on Twitter and I'll say, hey, God exists, a lot of times someone will ask a question, or a skeptic will ask, well, what's your proof? What proof do you have that God exists? Now, the dialectical situation there is a little different. If I'm coming over to you and I'm saying, hey, God exists, and you got to believe that, it's proper, I think, for someone to ask, well, what's your evidence? Why do you think that? Why should I believe that? I think that's an important, that's an okay question.
Right.
But on the other hand, if someone comes along and says, you don't know that God exists, the situation is different. And I think what you're pointing out here is that Plantinga pointed out back in the 70s and 80s is that just because, even if this person doesn't have an argument for their belief in God, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're irrational or unjustified. But that's a really interesting thing to think about, because I think an underlying assumption that's often had in these conversations about apologetics and God's existence is an assumption that you've got to have some kind of argument, you've got to have some kind of maybe scientific evidence for your beliefs, otherwise you're irrational or unjustified. So tell me a little more about how that works and explain it to our audience. How does that look? How does it work?
Yeah, so a couple things. One, let's take a dog or a young child, right, as an example. Does the dog, when it comes into the room and it sees that I got Whataburger, right, I brought home Whataburger, and it smells the delicious number 2 and the spicy ketchup, right? I mean, does it when it smells all this, is it naturally just forming its belief that there's food right there, or is it sort of giving arguments for these things, right? Or
formulating arguments in their mind,
right, subconsciously, or a young infant, right? Cognitive science tells us that they have very quickly, infants develop different beliefs, object permanence, that food's nearby, and so forth. And does it naturally just form beliefs, or does it subconsciously do like these Bayesian calculations, right? I think it's really implausible to think the latter. And so I think what's happening is you have their faculties are meeting certain stimuli, and sort of it naturally moves them doxastically to produce certain beliefs. And when it comes to belief in other minds or belief in object permanence, I think that it's not that these are really justified by way of arguments. In fact, a lot of epistemologists are inclined to think there really aren't great arguments for belief in other minds. But that doesn't mean we don't know that other minds don't exist. And so I think that if we're hardwired to believe in other minds or object permanence, or that there's food nearby, and and our faculties are functioning properly, and they're successfully aimed at truth, then we can know that there's food nearby, or that there are other minds, or that objects stay permanent even when you don't look at them. And so what I think is important here is that animals and young children have knowledge, but it's not like they have access to arguments and so forth. You don't always have to have access to arguments in order to know. I think when I hear of this idea that, hey, our brain is like in cognitive science, the paradigm used it sort of a computational model where our brains are basically kind of like computers, and computers have design plans. And as long as my equipment, my software is working properly, and if I'm designed to produce this belief and it's aimed at truth, then the belief it produces, I think, could constitute knowledge. And so when it comes to proper function in God, if God exists and he's designed our system, cognitive systems, to produce belief about him, and it's functioning properly and successfully aimed at truth, then we can know that he exists, even apart from argumentation.
So one of the things that you did was you pointed to some sort of mundane situations where we normally don't form arguments in the process of just forming these beliefs. And really, when we're talking about belief formation, I don't even know if it's like a process that we're aware of. So for example, I have the belief that this phone, my phone in front of me, exists, but I haven't thought through like an argument that my phone is here, or like this phone, my experience of this phone that's sitting in my hand, the best explanation of my experience is that it's really here. Like none of that happened in my mind. I just sort of found myself having this belief. And I think most everyone watching this would realize that that is a completely rational, completely justified belief for me to have. And then the question is, well, how could that be the case? How could he be justified and rational in having that belief if he didn't have an argument, if he didn't start out with an argument for that? And maybe you just want to bite the bullet and say, well, actually, he's not justified or not warranted in that belief because he didn't have an argument. But the problem with that is that if you go that route, then you're going to end up denying that we know much of anything. I think
right.
that's one of the things that Thomas Reid pointed out.
Yeah, so how do you know that your phone wasn't created 5 minutes ago? And in fact, the whole world was created 5 minutes ago. And there's just an appearance of age, and we sort of are programmed with certain memories, right? Maybe some malicious demon, malevolent demon is in our brains, is sort of hardwiring certain memories. How do we know that's not the case? I mean, obviously, we can't use that which is in question to justify it, so it's not like I can appeal to my memories or to the age of certain things, right? So how can I know that? And it seems to me that, again, if we're hardwired to believe that the past wasn't created 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age and memories, and my faculties are functioning properly, then I can know that. And so it seems like a common sense epistemology. If your epistemology is very much going against common sense, if it's not allowing for children and to know certain things, or young children, or the dog to know that he's a good boy, right? More seriously, the dog to know that there's a ball here or that food's here, then I think you should modify your epistemology. If your epistemology can't account for dogs and young infants knowing stuff, then I think you've gone wrong somewhere.
That's interesting to think about. Yeah, you've got to take like paradigm cases of when you do have knowledge and find a theory of knowledge that makes it to where you're not ruling out these paradigm cases.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So tell me some of the different views in religious epistemology, because some people still do defend this sort of, I don't want to call it outdated I'm not trying to be pejorative when I say it's outdated, but some people still do defend this idea that you've got to have arguments to have a rational belief in Christianity. And there are some contemporary proponents of these types of arguments in the literature. Even John DePoe, I think, is one of those. So tell me some of the, like in your books, your 5 different views book, what are the different approaches that people take to religious epistemology that are, you have your proper functionalist view, where if God has designed our brains in such a way and designed us such that we would just sort of naturally form these beliefs, and if it's a successful sort of situation where we're successfully getting those true beliefs most of the time, that's your view. But what are the other views, and what are some of the drawbacks or benefits of
Yeah, so, which I can remind your watchers, your viewers again, comes out February 6th. There's the My Proper Functionalist view. There is Logan Gage and Blake McAllister. They argue for something called phenomenal conservatism, which I'm actually quite sympathetic to when it comes to...
Yeah, and I think, I'm not going to jump in a whole lot here, but I think that this is what I was referring to earlier with Trent Doherty has sort of argued that your view is compatible with a view like that.
Right.
And so it's not that's not necessarily a competing view. Like you could combine the two, I think.
Right, yeah. So in the debate section where we're going back and forth with each other, it's kind of like, well, I think you should be a proper functionalist about warrant, and but I agree with you about justification here. And then they're kind of like, hey, maybe proper functionalism is true about warrant, but we're just talking about justification. So we're very you won't see like us going for each other's jugular or anything like that. But a metaphor.
Well, let's break some of these terms down too. So when you say phenomenal conservatism, like what's the basic view of that one?
So phenomenal conservatism, it's kind of like it's saying that our experiences, our beliefs, they're innocent until proven guilty, right? It's like a good justice system. And so if there's something called a seeming, it's like this experience that inclines you to a particular belief. And so I have a seeming that I'm talking to Cameron on my computer right now, right? Or I have a seeming that Jon Snow is right here with me, right?
So is a seeming like an intuition?
Yeah, so it's like it's this experience. It seems to me, right? You have this sort of experience that leads you to produce a certain belief, and so these seemings, the idea is that they can justify your beliefs. So by justification, you can talk about justification in different ways. The old school way, the way that I actually prefer to talk about justification, is deontologically. That's to say it's sort of like within your rights, right? Your duties. You have a duty to form your beliefs appropriately, and so in this case. I think that you've done your due diligence if you have a strong seeming that something's the case, and you don't have any defeaters. You don't have reasons that you think show otherwise. And so this is the kind of phenomenal conservatism view that
the innocent until proven guilty view.
Logan and Blake defend, which is absolutely compatible with Reformed epistemology. And in fact, in the book, we both are like, "Yay, we're both Reformed epistemologists," or these views can be compatible with both Reformed epistemology. Another view talked about in the volume I'm less familiar with. Eric Baldwin defends sort of a McIntyre. Maybe you've heard of Alistair McIntyre. He has like this traditions-based account where rationality is determined by the individual's tradition, and so.
I have not heard of that one.
Are sort of grow up in different traditions, right? Or maybe you're part of a Humean tradition. I'm part of a Christian tradition. Someone else is part of an Islamic tradition. Well, you can't sort of with one sort of swipe talk about who's rational and who's not, as if there's these transcendent standards of rationality. Rationality is sort of determined by the tradition. At least that's how I understand it. So my objections to him in the book were more like questions, clarifying exactly what his view holds to, because it's applying McIntyre, who's normally talked about when it comes to ethics and so forth, political theory and stuff, applying it to epistemology. And so Eric Baldwin does something really interesting, really cool, I think, and really being the first that I know of to really take his sort of views about politics and ethics and sort of make an epistemology out of it. So there's that view. There's a presuppositionalist view from Scott Oliphant, who says that we all know that God exists, right? But we're suppressing the truth and unrighteousness, and the object of epistemology is to demonstrate how people already know that God exists. The views I've discussed so far, I think, are all compatible with Reformed epistemology. I think most views, it's Andrew Moon, he has got a great article out, Recent Developments in Reformed Epistemology. I think it's Philosophy Compass, one of the two, that he talks about how most contemporary theories in epistemology are compatible with Reformed epistemology. It's not
Real quick, since I don't think we've actually defined Reformed epistemology. Sorry, right. I don't think we've defined Reformed epistemology. When he says that, or when we're referring to this term Reformed epistemology, all we mean is that this belief, or at least belief in God, can be rational without arguments.
Right.
That's all that it means.
Right. Your beliefs can be justified or warranted or rational apart from argumentation. The Reformed, don't let that trigger you if you're not Reformed in your soteriology. I'm not. I'm actually a Catholic, so. The Reformed bit stems exegetically from John Calvin's idea of the sensus divinitatis in Book 1 of the Institutes, where he talks about how we have this sense of divinity as part of our cognitive makeup. At least that's how Plantinga interprets him. So that's what I mean by Reformed epistemology. So the view that's not compatible with Reformed epistemology is
only 1 out of 5.
1 out of 5, I think.
Yeah.
According to Tyler. And
according to Tyler.
I think Eric and Logan would agree with me. I'm not sure if Scott would agree with me, but So John argues for something called classical foundationalism, He calls it the maybe he has a certain word for it. My brain is not working optimally right now, so I can't recall what he uses. But basically, classical foundationalism is the idea that you have to have arguments for your beliefs to be rational or justified, except for those beliefs that say you can't be wrong about, right? They're infallible. So maybe the belief that you exist, or the belief that you're being appeared to in a certain way, or the belief that you think you're at least in pain, right? I mean, these are typically the candidates of the sorts of beliefs that people have postulated for being beliefs that we can't be wrong about. So those sorts of beliefs add sort of a foundation of our knowledge. They are the basic beliefs. So
here's a question that I have real quick, just for some clarification here on what an infallible belief is. So normally when I think of a necessary truth, like 2 + 2 = 4, does John think that is something you could be wrong about?
Yeah, arithmetic, I'm not sure his views on numbers.
Okay.
In reference to if they're infallible. I mean, I imagine different classical foundationalists can believe different things about beliefs being infallible or not infallible. I'm skeptical that any human belief can be infallible. So that's one reason why I'm not attracted to classical foundationalism, because if you're inclined to think that no beliefs are infallible, at least that humans can have, then you wouldn't have.
No one has any knowledge.
so that's one reason. Yeah, I'm sorry. Were you saying something else, or?
No. I was just getting some clarity on what we mean by infallible. You were just explaining that there's like this bedrock of infallible beliefs that you think are at the bottom there.
So you have these bottom beliefs, call them basic beliefs, and then they're the properly basic if they're beliefs are such that you can't be wrong about, and then you have these arguments that are based on these sort of lower beliefs, right? The bottom beliefs, the basic beliefs, that they're based. They're properly based if they are sort of rest upon these properly basic beliefs. And so any belief that's not a properly basic belief, you're going to have arguments for on John DePauw's view. And so God, if it's not
or you're not rational.
Right. If it's not going to be properly based or a proper belief. And so if when it comes to God's existence, if you think it's not a belief that you can't be wrong about, some classical foundationalists will open the criteria to maybe self-evident beliefs or something like that. If God's not one of these sorts of beliefs, then you have to have arguments for him. And if there are no good arguments for God's existence, then belief in God's irrational. You're not justified in believing that God exists. You can't be warranted. And so that's the view that he holds. There's a handful of epistemologists that hold this view. But I think the majority, I think it's right in saying, and I think John would agree with me, the majority philosophers don't hold to that view anymore.
Right.
In fact, I think externalists in general, externalism, the idea that it's just the denial that we have to have access to reasons, to arguments, is sort of would be the majority position, if any.
Yeah, and what you said, Andrew points out in his paper on recent developments in Reformed epistemology, is he points out that most contemporary epistemological principles or views of epistemology are fully compatible with the thesis of Reformed epistemology, that you don't have to have arguments for your belief in God. And just to give an idea of how that works, with phenomenal conservatism, which was one of the views that you gave, which was the sort of innocent before proven guilty view, that one is compatible with Reformed epistemology because you don't have to have an argument in order for it to be innocent before proven guilty, right? You have this seeming, and you're justified in believing whatever it is that you believe in the absence of a defeater, and that's obviously compatible with not having an argument.
Sure.
So, and that's a really popular view in epistemology. Right. I mean, Michael Huemer, I think he's not the father of it, right? He's one of the most prominent defenders.
I think I mean, you might find and this would be a better question for Logan to answer, but I think you can find this sort of idea in previous philosophers, but I think Huemer is the one who sort of, in contemporary analytic philosophy, sort of solidified. I mean,
did he coin the term too?
I believe so, yeah. Swinburne does talk about the principle of credulity, which is basically the same idea, and he talked about that before Huemer did. But if we're talking about the sort of contemporary lingo, so to speak, I could be wrong, but I think Huemer is responsible for that.
Well, so why do you think that this idea that you've got to have arguments, you've got to have evidence or proof or scientific proof for your beliefs, why do you think that this is so prevalent in culture? Is it just sort of an intuition that people have? What do you think is going on here?
Yeah, so I think we've been brainwashed by the Enlightenment, where the idea is that science tells everything, right?
Yeah.
In order to know something, you have to figure it out in a laboratory, right? You've got to be able to look under a microscope and be able to see it. And I think that upon reflection, that obviously is false, right? I mean, that epistemology is self-defeating. If in order if you can only know by science, I mean, do you know that you can only know by science through science? I think you're in danger of self-defeat. But yeah, I think that we're sort of taught from a young age, even in school, like, show me the science. Where's the evidence, right? And at least I remember going through public school and hearing these sorts of phrases, thrown around in the science class or whatnot. And I think we're just not really self-reflective enough. So, I mean, obviously ethical propositions, I think we can know. I don't know how you can know them through science. So if you think that abstract objects exist, or that there's a law of non-contradiction, I think we can come to know these sorts of things, and it's not through empirical methods. And I think that if we reflect, maybe we'd realize that some of the beliefs that we originally come to hold, and I think we would say that we were originally rational, those beliefs were we come to hold apart from argumentation. This is why whenever I taught my first semester philosophy intro class, and I talked about Descartes and the Cartesian demon, how do you know you're not being tricked by a demon? How do you know you're not a brain in the matrix? Lots and lots and lots of times I'd have students just being like, nope, we don't know. Probably is the case. We have no evidence. Where's the science? And if the science we have is compatible with being tricked by demons, then there's no way to know. I mean, the students would give up so quickly their belief that I was standing in front of them, and I think that's because they bought into a scientism, a hard evidentialism, that when they were intellectually sort of challenged, they would actually give up common sense before they would give up their epistemology, because they don't know that there are other epistemologies out there. And in fact, most epistemologists wouldn't make those sorts of claims. But with people like the new atheists and people on YouTube making videos about that seemingly endorse scientism or some sorts of scientism, even if it's a rebranded scientism, I think that Christian philosophers and apologists and so forth, and just Christians in general, have their work for them to go and to encourage the unbeliever to self-reflect, to think a little bit more.
Yeah, so going back to that phrase, good epistemology covers a multitude of sins. Yeah, so good epistemology would prevent us from giving up common sense beliefs, like you're standing in front of me.
Exactly. Right. Yeah, whenever students are willing to deny that I'm standing in front of them, I'm like, really, you can't know that I'm in front of you? And they're just like, no, I can't know. I sort of make a big deal out of it. So what? You can't know that this board's here? You can't know that you have a wife? Yes. You can't know that your wife exists? You go home to her tonight and tell her, sweetie, I don't know you love me. In fact, I don't even know you exist. And playing around, being silly like that. But this class starts to laugh and sort of understand that this seems sort of absurd.
Yeah, and I think here's something that sort of goes on beneath the surface, or maybe it's not always beneath the surface. It is raised every now and then, but I've seen some people say that there's a whole lot more consensus and there's less disagreement in science. But when it comes to religious beliefs, or I guess it does really sort of apply, because this is an objection that's often thrown at religion, is, well, there's all this religious diversity, people have all these different views, and so we can't trust any belief that's based on this sort of basic, or this experience that you have, this religious experience. You can't trust it because there's just so much disagreement. Whereas with science or scientific claims, there's not disagreement, or even claims about the external world. About Tyler, you being up in the front of the class. Pretty much every student in there is going to agree that, it seems like he's up there.
Right.
So there's more agreement when it comes to different beliefs. So when there's less agreement, then maybe that's a reason to doubt that we can just sort of trust our intuitive sense of what's going on.
Right. So that I think actually isn't right. So for example, in science, like when you get to the more abstract science, like quarks versus string theory, quantum mechanics, how many different interpretations do we have? Different models of macro evolution and so forth. Like I think that when it comes to Lorentzian interpretation or versus the relativity, I mean, when it comes to these complex scientific questions, there are disagreements quite widespread, and that's one of the things that makes science interesting, to see if certain theories gain traction and then they fail, and then someone else comes up with another theory, right, and then it gains traction and so forth. And I'm a realist when it comes to science. I'm not saying we should endorse non-realism or something, but and same thing with politics or ethical views, right? People disagree about certain things being moral. People disagree about politics. I mean, we're so polarized currently in America regarding the political system. And are you going to say that we can't know anything, that certain policies are good or bad, or certain moral actions are moral or immoral? I think that.
Well, I think that atheists do use that.
Yeah.
I think that atheists do use the same sort of argument that there's so much disagreement about morality that maybe we should just jettison objective morality altogether. And I think that's actually a big reason why people are inclined toward moral subjectivism.
Yeah, well, so what I had in mind were actually like ethicists, not sort of layman atheists. So most ethicists believe in objective morality. Like most, it's not a. I mean, there definitely are anti-realists about morality and philosophy and ethics, but there's a lot more realists than I think people realize. A lot of people who actually do believe that they're objective, really right and wrong things, that it's objectively wrong to mutilate a young child for fun, right?
Yeah, and I've interviewed an atheist, Eric Wielenberg, on my show, and we talked about he gave a defense of objective morality. So there's a lot more in the academy than there are online, which is interesting to see the disparity there.
And I think it becomes in largely because, again, they're not as self-reflective. They're not as up to date on the current literature and so forth. But in reference to science, giving up science, at least the interesting things in science, giving up the interesting things in politics, giving up morality, I think that's a high cost, just because there's diversity that necessitates defeat. And so, I mean, and I kind of look at religious belief. You could look at it like this. So Kelly James Clark and Justin Barrett. I think you've had both of them on actually at different times, maybe.
I haven't had Kelly on.
Okay, you had Justin on, I believe.
Yeah.
When they argue that, well, maybe our faculty that's responsible for producing religious belief, maybe it is sort of generally reliable, where it gets us in contact with the divinity. It lets a lot of people know that there is something supernatural, right? But so it's reliable in that sense. Maybe it's just not sort of like fine-grained beliefs that are being reliably produced. Like, I maybe believe in this God, you believe in that God, you believe in ghosts, and you believe in some other supernatural phenomena. But I don't see why we couldn't see this. So in religious epistemology, I call this the dark room analogy, where it could be such that we're all in a dark room. Our faculties would all be reliable in getting us to produce the belief that there are objects in this dark room, right? They're reliable in that sense. But then we should feel around, right? Maybe I'm like, oh, this is a vending machine, and you come along like, this is clearly a piano. I mean, there's disagreement here, there's diversity here, but then we go through trial and error to try to figure out, is it a vending machine or is it a piano? And then we find out it's actually neither. It's a computer, right? Supercomputer. And so you can use philosophy and science to help fine-tune your beliefs, to help sort of figure out exactly what's really there. And so this faculty could allow us to know that something is there, and then we use our reason and science to figure out more precisely what's there. And so that's one way of looking at it. And there's other ways to look at this issue as a proper functionalist. I think that, hey, even if there's diversity, if you're hardwired to believe P, even on reflecting on diversity, and your faculties are functioning properly and successfully aimed at truth, then you can know P even in light of diversity. If you're just hardwired to believe that mutilating people for fun is wrong, and there's someone else, maybe all of a sudden like a new trend happens and people start saying, oh, it's not wrong, it's not wrong, even in light of that diversity. If you're hardwired to believe that mutilating people for fun is wrong, and your faculties are successfully aimed at truth and properly functioning, then you can know it, even in light of reflecting on that diversity. Or let's say that you wake up one day and all of a sudden people are like, actually, I don't exist. I'm a Cartesian trick from a demon monster. I'm a hallucination. Or someone comes around and says, I'm actually a projection from your mind to help you feel comforted in this lonely and dark world, similar to Freud's view of God. And all of a sudden, you ran into a lot of diversity about if there were other minds. Again, if you're hardwired to still believe that other minds exist, even in light of this diversity, and your faculties are functioning properly, your programming is so good and such that you could still know in light of this diversity. And I think the same thing comes with religious diversity as well.
So let's talk about one more thing. Actually, we're about to move into live Q&A, and so let me just give these, and then I'm going to set you up, and then as the questions start to come in, I'll start to populate them. So let me just give you guys some quick tips here for the live Q&A that's about to go down. Ask your questions in the live chat. Obviously, one question per person, please. Tag at Capturing Christianity so I can make sure to see your question that you have for Dr. McNabb. Make sure that your question is on topic. We're talking about religious epistemology, how we can know that God exists, scientism, whether or not we need proof for God's existence in order to know that God exists, and also super chat questions are automatically bumped to the top of the queue. So with that in mind, I'm going to leave these up here. So Tyler, let's talk briefly about equal weight theory, because I think that's going to have, it's very relevant to what we were just talking about regarding agreement, disagreement. And I've written an article, not an article, but a post about this. So I have a little experience with it, but you also wrote one on your blog that I thought was really interesting. And just tell me about equal weight theory and sort of what the implications are here and how it all works.
Hold on one second. I'm going to pull a Marco Rubio. Hold on.
No worries. Get you some water.
So equal weight theory is this idea that we should give equal weight to another's opinion. And some people think that means we should decrease our level of our credence for thinking something is true in light of someone else thinking that something is false. Some people think that we should just totally suspend. We should be agnostic about it. If you disagree and I agree, then we should just meet in the middle and say, we don't know, right? And that's the specific equal weight theory that I was targeting. And it seems to be self-defeating, because if you have peers, that's to say people who are roughly as smart as you, who've read the literature just as you have, and they're disagreeing about the equal weight theory, then guess what? We should suspend belief about the equal weight theory, and if it's true. So I think a lot of times people just think automatically there's diversity, therefore we should suspend belief. When it comes to sometimes ethics, when it comes to religion for sure. But again, this never gets applied to science or philosophy or politics. Right? I mean, how many people think that Trump shouldn't be president or that he should be impeached? But hey, you can't know that if you agree with the equal weight theory and you have peers who think that Trump shouldn't be impeached or that he actually is the president, right? So, I mean, we don't apply it to lots of things consistently.
All right. Well, it looks like we're still waiting for questions to come in. So if we don't have any, then that's fine. We're actually going to just end it a little bit earlier. Someone said, do you know anything about theological non-cognitivism? Tyler?
Is that just sort of like a fiction about relief?
Maybe
what they have in mind.
I'm still unsure. He's saying that I asked this question to Justin Mooney that I had on Tuesday, and I can't remember if we figured it out what it was. Okay, here he goes. He says, how does theological non-cognitivism intersect with religious epistemology?
So I think that would assume already that, if I'm understanding his view correctly, it would already assume that there is nothing actually really there, that God doesn't exist. And that would like sort of the Reformed epistemologist would say like that begs the question, right? Because the whole part is, given what we know, is it epistemically possible that we can know that God exists? And so I think from the get-go, you're already saying God doesn't exist, unless I'm misunderstanding what he means by non-cognitive religious views or whatever.
Non-cognitivism. I'm thinking it might have to do with the fact, or with someone who thinks that claims about, or theological claims just have
They're
no
not
meaning.
true. Yeah. So that would seem to beg the question against the Reformed epistemologist from the get-go. So you would have to argue for it, the claim that there are no religious truths.
So explain what you mean by that.
You would have to. So you couldn't just sort of assert that the proposition that God exists or that God loves me isn't true, or
you'd need to give an argument.
You would need an argument. Else, if you just merely assert it, the Reformed epistemologist is going to just simply, say, "Oh, well, that's nice," sort of move.
All right. Well, we do have some questions that are popping in here now, so let me go ahead and move to our first one. It's from Randall Price, who is actually a previous student of yours. He says, "How can we be certain that our cognitive faculties are functioning properly?"
Well, one way is see if I can go back and go into the system and give Randy an F. No. Yeah, so I don't. So this is the interesting thing about the sort of view that I took. So the proper functionalist view. I'm assuming that's what he's referring to, not the other views that we talked about. We don't have to know that the conditions are in place in order to know. So think about a dog, right? When the dog sees that there's the ball there, right? Ball, 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 right? It's freaking out because the ball's in front of it. It's not like it knows that its faculties are functioning properly or aimed at truth. So I don't think you actually have to know that the conditions are in place in order for you to know. It's a denial of KK thesis that you have to know that you know, or JJ thesis, you have to know that you're justified. So that's the sort of response that I would give. I would just deny that you have to have access to that. I mean, to say that you do have to have access to that seems like an internalist trick.
Or one you said it one way to me. It seems like you're just forcing someone to put on a really thick internalist straitjacket.
Right. Why be in the straitjacket? I don't like the straitjacket. Let me take this off.
Yeah.
I like this.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
All right, let me pull up my next question here. Sorry, I'm trying to do like 5 things at once.
No?
It's a little bit difficult. All right, let's get the next question up here. And this one is from Rufus Cat 2 Whose Name. Interesting YouTube name there. How can you claim to, quote unquote, know something when you admit there is no proof?
Well, first off, I didn't say there was no proof. I actually think there are good arguments for God's existence. I've defended the moral argument. I've defended, with Jeremy Neal, a argument from a political argument for God's existence. You mean like contingency arguments the first way? I think those are all good arguments. I think there's an argument from knowledge. So I'm not against natural theology or the idea that we can know that God exists through argumentation, using our natural resources, so to speak, apart from divine revelation. So that's the question seemed to assume that I thought that there was no proof. But my point is that you don't have to have arguments in order to know. And so I gave various examples of why I think that we don't actually have to have arguments in order to know things, such as when animals and young infants know things, they don't have arguments. And to be honest, when I just think of the proper functional constraints, right? I mean, I have a brain, and it's like a computer, and it has programming, and if it's successfully aimed at truth and functioning properly when it produces a belief, I don't have the intuition that I also have to have arguments. What I'm producing, it seems to be sufficiently rational or warranted. So I guess that's how I would probably reply. And by the way, I think you have something that says home behind you. At first, I read it as Hume, and I was like, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, no, it's home. It says home. Yeah, that's my wife. She's the decorator around here.
Thought I was like, wait, is this capturing Christianity, turning Humean, or
No, not in the slightest. He's like one of my least favorite philosophers.
way
All right.
overrated?
Yeah, way overrated. But there is a reason why he's so widely discussed. All
I
right, next.
read on Hume. Reed won't even call Hume in some of his works. He's like, that philosopher who wrote this.
Oh my gosh. All right, well, we did have a super chat, so really appreciate it, Nelson. He says, making predictions is to make arguments, correct? Since predictions are based in the future and evidence is based in the past or present? Question mark.
Can he?
Let me read it. I'll read the whole thing again.
Okay.
Making predictions is to make arguments, correct? Since predictions are based in the future and evidence is based in the past or present? Question mark.
Maybe he's getting at the problem of induction, or do you have an idea
I'm not really
where he's coming from?
No, I'm actually not sure. So Nelson, I'm going to check the live chat and see if you have a clarification here on that one. Otherwise, I'm not really sure how to cash that one out. He might have said it somewhere else in the live chat, but it's difficult to navigate through this while I'm trying to do all these other things at once. So
Because
Nelson, yeah.
Let me clarify, at least from the part that I did understand, because I'm not making a prediction based off of argumentation, some probability claim, right? I'm saying if God exists and if he's designed our cognitive faculties in this way, where we're designed to produce belief about him, and if we're functioning properly, then we could know that God exists apart from argument. So I don't think that's like a prediction claim based off of arguments. If that's what maybe he was understanding it as, and if that's not the question, then perhaps he could just rephrase it. And
yeah, Nelson, let me know what you meant there, and we'll go ahead and move on to the next question in the meantime. From Seth Clement, he says, if a non-theist cannot know that theism is false without establishing that God does not exist, can theists know that theism is true without establishing that God does exist?
So I think when it comes to justification, so again, justification is distinct from warrant, right? So let me define justification and warrant again, and then I'll answer the question. Justification, I mean, sort of, it's within one's right to believe something. So it comes cheaply, right? Lots of people can be justified about certain things. If it seems that way to you and you don't have any defeaters for that belief, I think you're justified in believing that. Warrant is a stronger ingredient to some degree. It's that ingredient that turns true belief into knowledge. So you can have a true belief. For example, you can have the belief that the Golden State Warriors will not lose another game this season and will make it to the playoffs and go undefeated in the playoffs. Right? That could actually turn out to be true. But few people would probably call that knowledge, given, assuming they keep the same roster and, Curry's not playing and Durant doesn't come back and Cousins doesn't, come back and so forth. A few people would think that I knew that. They'd be like, you were probably a Warriors Homer fan and you just got lucky, something like that. So warrant separates mere true belief from knowledge. So you can have a true belief but not know. And so warrant is that, as one former student called it, that special sauce. When you add it to true belief, it blossoms, it turns into knowledge. And so I think you can have as it pertains to justification, have a justified belief that atheism is true, apart from argumentation. I don't think you have to establish through arguments that atheism is true in order to be justified. Perhaps you're going through a horrific evil, right? And all of a sudden you just find yourself believing that God doesn't exist. When it comes to warrant, however, I don't think actually that if atheism is true, we could have knowledge at all. I take it that proper functions required for warrant, and there are no good naturalistic accounts of proper function, no good atheistic accounts of proper function. And so if proper function is necessary for warrant, then and atheism is true and you can't account for proper function on atheism, then I take it that you can't have knowledge on atheism, you can't have warrant on atheism. And so I don't think you can be warranted. It's possible to be have warranted atheistic belief, but I do think that you could have justified atheistic belief apart from argumentation.
So someone in the live chat saying that you just strawmanned atheism.
Okay, how so?
They said atheism is the default position. Bruce Wayne is his name. Batman.
Bruce Wayne. I I think Bruce Wayne ends up becoming a Christian in the comics, so I don't know. Maybe this will happen here too. So yeah, I don't think that atheism is the default position. I guess I don't know. There's different ways you could mean that, right? If you mean that atheism is the default position in such a way that we're sort of all naturally just atheists and we have to acquire religious belief or something like that, which is how I'm interpreting the comment. So please correct me if I'm wrong. I don't want to misinterpret the questioner. But I mean, cognitive science of religion seems to suggest otherwise. It seems to.
So he's saying that atheism is a lack of belief.
Oh, I see. He's the definition of what atheism actually is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if he was implying the other way, cognitive science of religion, the paradigm view is that religious beliefs is spandrel, an evolutionary byproduct of certain advantageous faculties, beliefs, and so forth. That aided in survival, so it's a byproduct of these sorts of things. So we all naturally sort of are inclined to produce religious belief, given one theory is that we have a hyper agency detection device. This sort of we over detect agency even when agency isn't there, because organisms that detect agency more so than not, right, are probably going to survive a lot better than organisms that don't detect agency enough. So you throw that in with a theory of mind, and you have explanations for why people believe in the supernatural. So it's just sort of untrue that we're all sort of born atheists and we have to learn theism. But if he meant merely he disagrees with the definition of atheism that I'm using, I could appeal to different peer-reviewed articles or something that defines atheism as the belief that there is no God, not the lack of belief.
Graham Oppy has a book, like literally a book. He wrote a book on it. And defines it in the traditional sense.
Philosophers who are atheists will agree with me on this. I've actually there might be some philosophers who disagree on that definition, but as far as I'm concerned, they've been few. The majority opinion is atheism is the belief that there is no God.
Yeah, we actually did and I interviewed, I'm like blanking right now, Chris Gadsden. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but we did a whole podcast, or not podcast, but an interview on the definition of atheism, and we talked about the fact that like if you give a concept or if you define a term, so suppose that like we're talking about horses and I defined a horse as anything that has four wheels. Like that's a bad way to define that term, even if someone wants to use it that way. It's a bad way to define that term. So the question would be then, what is the best way to analyze the concept of atheism? And one of the things that we pointed out there was with this lack of belief definition is that it's not specific enough. It doesn't tell you like what you're actually referring to, because you could be referring to someone who disbelieves in God, has the belief that God does not exist, or you could be referring to someone who's just completely undecided, who is like a perfect agnostic. So It doesn't tell you enough. It doesn't actually point out what you're trying to get at. So that's one of the deficiencies of that definition of atheism. But
it also makes it seem like dogs are atheists and monkeys and horses and infants are atheists, and that seems rather not accurate in how we're trying to use the term. Not helpful, at least. Right.
It'd be like saying that your horse has four wheels. All right. So here's the next question. Let me go ahead and pull it up as my computer populates it. Clayton Reed, how do we know that only one God exists rather than a pantheon? I have a pantheist friend I'm trying to witness to.
Well, one argument that you could use, if by pantheism you mean the belief that God is the impersonal everything or something like that. So that's how I understood when you said pantheist, but pantheon makes me think that, I don't know, it's like an echoing.
Polytheism?
Polytheism. So if it's in reference to the latter, pantheism, or panentheism, in the World Religions book I co-authored with Eric, we actually go to great lengths to argue that pantheistic accounts of proper function won't work. And so if you think that proper function is necessary for warrant, which we give arguments for thinking that, then if pantheism is true, you couldn't even know that pantheism was true. So there's that sort of approach one could take. For me, personally, if it's an existential question, when I look at the starry skies and I just find myself believing that there's a transcendent agent behind it. Or when I pick up a flower and look at its delicacy, I just find myself believing there's a transcendent agent who created this or is responsible for this. My seemings don't necessarily express multiple gods. For those who do have that seemings, then maybe what you should do is just try to give them defeaters, give them different philosophical arguments for why there aren't multiple gods. That's probably the best way forward, I think.
All right, let's move on to the next question. I'm going to try to get through these a little bit quicker. Next one is, what's the takeaway? Do you feel that popular atheist objections to God commit the incredulity or ignorance fallacy? That's a little off topic, but do you have any thoughts?
If popular atheism commits the
incredulity or ignorance fallacy. I'm not familiar with either of those terms.
Yeah. Nor am I. So maybe, maybe not.
Okay. It's actually going to take me a second. Do you want to say anything else about that while I get this next question up here?
Yeah, if by ignorance fallacy that it just mean like they're ignorant about something, or they don't, something's not within their purview, so they're just going to go ahead and say it doesn't exist or something like that. Like it's a quick generalization, sort of a generalization fallacy. I think it depends on the atheist and who's making, how they're making the claim that atheism is true. So I think it would be context sensitive.
Gotcha. All right, the next one is from Brent Kalar. He says, how is Reformed epistemology different from presuppositional apologetics? This is a perfect time to plug your this dialogue that you did on it.
Yeah. So once again, John DePoe and I edited a book. You should buy it, February 6th. It has a presuppositionalist in there, Scott Oliphant. So I take it that he's one of the sort of foremost defenders of presuppositionalism today, and at least in the academic circles.
Yeah, exactly. That's an important distinction to make, because in academic circles is a lot different than what you see online from someone like Cy Ten Bruggencate, you know.
Yeah. And so one of the biggest differences is that I offer my model as a conditional. So if God exists, if he's given us this faculty, then we can know that he exists, upon that faculty functioning properly. The presuppositionalist sort of just asserts God exists. And so you're asserting that which is in question, which is going to bring out a whole bunch of question-begging sort of complaints from your friendly atheists who you're dialoguing with. And so I think you can avoid all of that. I think that whole debate is unnecessary and not as helpful as merely making the conditional claims. So that would be one big distinction between how we normally approach these sorts of things with unbelievers.
Gotcha. All right, I'm getting the next question up here. I'm almost there. Just waiting on my computer. So what?
Just say actually one other thing. I actually think
go ahead.
Everyone knows that God exists. So that's another big difference from presuppositionalism. So I think people literally do have damaged sensus divinitatis, right? Their faculties are not working as properly. None of our faculties, I think, are working as optimally as they could. But I think some of our sense of divinity, right, is some of our faculties, sense of divinity, are working better than in others. And so I'm okay with saying that some people don't know that God exists. Infants, zygotes, right? I mean, I think that perhaps they don't know that God exists. In fact, I'm quite inclined to think that. People who are severely mentally challenged, I'm inclined to think at least some of them don't know that God exists, right? So that's another big thing. My apologetic isn't to show you that you actually believe that God exists and here's why X, Y, Z.
Yeah, right.
Supposing God and your logic and morality. That's not the goal of my approach.
All right, next question is from Mashi MYYM. Shouldn't he say that he has strong evidence to support his belief that the Creator exists instead of saying he knows the Creator exists, especially in the case of not needing proof? So instead of saying that you know God exists, you should just say that you have strong evidence for it.
Right. Well, so I actually haven't been talking about evidence. So I'm fine with saying I have strong evidence. I do think I have strong evidence. But unless you're wanting to say just my experiences of God is my strong evidence, I'm not sure if you're willing to concede that. I'd be more than happy to say that. What I've been mainly talking about are conditions. And if these conditions are in place, then I would have warrant. And I think knowledge just is warranted true belief. So then I would have knowledge. So I think I know God exists. Am I giving an argument to show that I know that God exists? No. I've given conditionals that here's how I could know that God exists. That's to say, I've given conditionals to show that it's epistemically possible that I know that God exists. I haven't demonstrated that I know that God exists. Personally, do I think I do? Yes. But that's not been the object of the epistemology that I've been especially in an apologetics context that I've been pushing.
All right, last question, and then we're going to close it out. This one's from Anthony Rowden. He says, how would you respond to another person from a different religion who says that their belief is properly basic? Would it just come down to discussing arguments at that point?
Right, it could. So again, diverse. Just because someone says they have a diverse belief, a different religious belief, that doesn't necessitate that your belief is irrational, right? So I'm fine with that. At the end of the day, if two people are claiming that you have properly basic religious belief and I have properly basic religious belief, and we're sort of at a standstill, that's okay. That doesn't mean you have to defeat your belief. You have a defeater for your belief. Similar to like the other mind scenario that I gave you earlier, right? Let's say that there are people who believe that there aren't other minds. Well, their mere existence and their mere belief and their mere claim that they have strong seemings that there are no other minds or something like that, that wouldn't necessitate the defeat of your belief that there are no other minds. However, you could give them arguments. Argument for the resurrection, I think, is a big one. I think that there's solid historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. See Michael Licona or William Lane Craig's work on that, N.T. Wright. But then also,
yesterday we posted a 3.5 hour video of all the evidence for the resurrection, by the way, if you guys haven't seen it.
So you should watch that. You should watch that and buy the 5 Views book. Am I right? No. So in this book, Eric Baldwin and I, we go through different religious traditions and actually say that there are lots of religious traditions that actually can't make sense of proper function or cognitive faculties aimed at truth. So there's that sort of route that you can take as well.
All right, well, let's close it out. We've gone a little bit longer than normal. So I really appreciate you coming on. Tyler, is there anything that you'd like to leave our audience with other than reminding them to buy your 5 Views book? No. Just if you have any questions, feel free to find me up, look me up on Facebook or the University of Macau's website. You can find my email there, and I'll be more than happy to engage questions. So that's about it. Oh, yes. Cool. Yeah. So other than epistemology, what sort of subjects are you interested in?
Philosophy, religion, obviously.
What's your favorite argument for God's existence? Let me ask you that.
Probably.
And don't give me like the cumulative case. Don't do that.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't do that to you. The moral argument, actually, both the epistemological version and the ontological version. So the idea that you probably wouldn't have moral knowledge if atheism was true, right? I don't think you would. So I think that there's a case to be made. We do have moral knowledge, so probably God exists, something like that. And then also the ontological claim, the idea that it's really hard for me to account for moral duties on atheism. So I think you can count for moral values and even duties in some sense, but I don't think you can really capture the full robustness of our phenomenology apart from divine commands. So
when it comes to the moral argument, what do you do? I'm not going to keep you too much longer because we're both itching to go watch this game. But what do you do when you come across someone who just is not going to accept the second premise that moral facts are real? Yeah, that we do have these moral obligations.
I'll try to explain to them if they think it's moral diversity. I'll try to explain how moral diversity actually looks worse than it is. There's James Rachel does a study in one of his Intro to Ethics books and basically traces 3 moral imperatives that are found in most cultures: murder, not murdering, not lying, that sort of thing. Maybe it's not stealing. I forget what the third one is. Oftentimes what happens with moral diversity is it's a culture putting a different emphasis on a moral value. That's different than another culture putting their emphasis on a different moral value. They both affirm the moral value, right? They just will emphasize it. It'll override the other moral values. So you see that, for example, talk about the pro-life debate, right? Some people think that it's wrong. I'm one of them. That human abortion is wrong. I'm putting my value on life. Well, other people who even they think that it's life think that autonomy can outweigh should outweigh the concerns of innocent life here. And so it's not like they're disagreeing with me, like life's just unimportant or life is totally irrelevant or who cares about life? I mean, it's not like that, right?
They're putting more weight on a different moral concern.
Exactly. But like the fundamental moral concerns are there. That's why evolutionary psychology and cognitive science is brilliant, because it helps us see why we all believe that there are, or most of us believe that there are objective moral values and duties. We evolved that way. We evolved to believe certain things. And so that's how these fields can be so powerful, is because there is consistency and cohesive unity. But so if after explaining that, after I say, don't you just have it, I'll try to think of a morally absurd situation, mutilating someone for fun. And if they're still like, nope, don't think it's wrong, then I'll just be like, okay, next argument. Then maybe I give them the first way or the contingency argument, and go that route.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm not going to keep you any longer. So I really appreciate you coming on to talk about religious epistemology. And maybe we'll do something more specific in religious epistemology, like defend proper functionalism. I think that would be a worthwhile discussion to have at some point, because it's a view that I lean toward, but I would like to pick someone's brain about it a little bit more in depth. So that'd be cool. All right. Well, thanks for joining me. Again, if you want to learn more about what I do, you can head over to my website, capturingchristianity.com. You can also support me, patreon.com/capturingchristianity. And until next time, we'll see you guys later. Have a good evening. Have a good night. And yeah, Christianity's true.